and talk about tissues. We're going to continue on with our tissues. We finished up the epithelial tissue last time. And so well, we didn't really technically finish it up, but we finished talking about some of the basic parts of the epithelial tissue. And I want to include glands in the epithelial tissue because the glands here are going to be made up of epithelial tissue. So when we discuss glands, right, you can either have one individual cell or you can have an organ that is made up of many cells. And glands make stuff. They synthesize stuff and then they secrete it. And so there's two types of glands that we're going to discuss. There's endocrine glands and exocrine glands. You need to know the difference. Endocrine glands lack ducts. Exocrine glands have ducts. So the endocrine glands are usually going to secrete their whatever it is that they made, their hormones, into the bloodstream. They'll either deposit it directly into the bloodstream or close to a blood vessel, and then those hormones will eventually make their way into the bloodstream. Okay, so endocrine glands lack ducts, so therefore they have to secrete their hormones into the blood. That's it. That's all I'm going to talk about for endocrine glands. Okay, because you're going to spend a whole chapter on that, and when you get into 211, chapter 17, that's the first thing you're going to talk about. You're going to learn about endocrine glands. So we're going to talk about exocrine glands. And so, like I said, exocrine glands are made up of epithelial tissue. And what happened was exocrine glands, this epithelial tissue, which was on the outside, all right, it actually invaginated itself. What does that mean? That means it actually pushed its way down into the tissue below the epithelial tissue. What's the tissue below the epithelial tissue? Connective tissue, which we're going to talk about tonight. Okay, so these glands push their way down into the connective tissue, but they're still made up of epithelial tissue. And we'll see that the surface here in the skinny area, that is going to be made up of epithelial tissue. That is the duct. And then we're going to have the part of the gland that actually makes the secretions, and that's called the acini, and that's the secretory portion. So when we talk about the exocrine glands, we're going to be talking about, all right, sweat glands, our salivary glands. Some of you just use some of your salivary glands if you just ate. Okay, and then the mammary glands. They are a modified version of a sweat gland, except instead of producing sweat, mammary glands are going to produce milk. Okay, so remember what I said. Glands can either be one cell or many cells. So the single cell glands, what we call unicellular glands, right? We've already seen a type already. Those are the goblet cells. And the unicellular exocrine glands, again, I've told you in this course, there's going to be some exceptions to the rule. Even though they're an exocrine gland, all right, they do not contain a duct. And the reason why is because they're so close to the epithelial surface, there's really no need for the duct. Okay? There's no need for it. So these types of glands are one cell in size. Goblet cells, which we saw, which make the mucin, all right, which is that glycoprotein that when it mixes with water, it turns into mucus. So the other type of glands that for the exocrine glands are the multicellular glands. Obviously, multi means many or numerous. And there's two parts to, all right, these type of glands. We have the part that's going to make the secretions, all right, that is going to be known as the acini, or physiologically or functionally, we call that the secretory portion. And then we have the other part of the gland, which is the duct, and that's going to transport the secretions from the secretory portion or the acini to the epithelial surface. So like a sweat gland. Sweat glands are in the skin underneath the surface. They secrete and make sweat, and then they transport that sweat onto the surface of your skin. Well, these multicellular exocrine glands have a protective coating to them. And we call that the fibrous capsule. So here's our gland. And then we've got our fibrous capsule that goes around it. And sometimes that fibrous capsule will invaginate itself into the gland. And when it does that, it makes these little compartments. And those compartments are what we call septa. And another name for those compartments are going to be lobes, these areas here. Okay. So I'm going to quickly teach you how we classify the anatomy of these glands. Remember, there's two parts of the gland. There's the secretory portion. Okay, that's the acini, and then there's the duct. That's the part that transports the secretions to the epithelial surface. So we're going to break it down into two parts. Okay, you have your simple, all right, let's break it down first. Everything above the red line. Simple glands and compound glands. So if the duct branches, it's known as a compound gland. If it doesn't branch, then it's known as a simple gland. And so that has to do with the duct. The other mode of classification is going to be what the acini or secretory portion looks like. If the duct and the secretory portion have the same diameter, so it basically looks like one big long tube, and you can't really differentiate the duct from the acini or the secretory portion, then we call those tubular glands. If you go from the duct and then it goes into this big bulge at the end of the duct, like a grape hanging off of on a cluster on a vine there, okay? That expanded portion is the secretory portion or the acini, okay? Then we call that type of gland an acinar gland. In some glands, you have a mixture of both. So if you have some secretory portions, all right, that are tubular, and some of the secretory portions are going to have that expanded acinar region there, then we call that a tubulo-acinar gland. So it has both tubules and both acini. So let me show you. All right, so on the top here, you can see we have simple glands. On the bottom, you can see we have compound glands. So if you look at the simple glands, we have one duct. One, okay? So those are simple glands. But if you look now at the secretory portion down the bottom here, you can see for the simple tubular one, the secretory portion looks to be about the same as the duct. So we then modify it and call it a simple unbranched duct, tubular, meaning the secretory portion has the same diameter as the duct does. Then you can see here we have a simple branch tubular, and that's saying again, the duct portion is single, unbranched, but the tubular portion branches out. You can see there's different arrangements, simple coiled tubular, because basically it's a simple tubular, except we just rolled it up like a carpet when you're going to clean the hardwood floors. A lot of your sweat glands are simple coiled tubulars. Then you can see here we have the simple acinar, and you can see we've expanded that secretory portion. Now, when we get down to the compound glands, you can see we have several ducts. So you have your compound tubular, which means the secretory portion for all of those glands, they're going to have the same diameter as all the branched ducts. And then if you go to the middle, you got the compound acinar. You can see that the secretory portion has an expanded sac on all of those ducts. And then we go to the compound tubular acinar, and you can see how some parts of the secretory portion have the same diameter as the duct, and some parts are expanded. So we call that a compound because there's branching ducts, tubular acinar. Okay, now that is it for the epithelial tissue. So let's move on to Rachel, no worries. I'm glad you're here now. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So let me review what you should know for this chapter. All right, 4 types of tissue. First one is what we just covered, epithelial. The second one is what we're going to talk today about, okay? Connective tissue. Then we have muscle. Oops. And then we have nervous. Know this, know this, know this. You will be asked about this on a test. 4 types of tissue. Next class, I will probably ask you to type it in. 4 types of tissue: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. Today, we're going to cover connective tissue. All right. I feel like the first 2 types of tissue are the most complicated, or not the most complicated, but the hardest to understand because there's a lot. Muscle and nervous tissue is pretty easy in comparison to the other 2 types. Let me be specific. Okay, so let's talk about connective tissue. Connective tissue has 3 components, similar to epithelial tissue, but not the same. All right, connective tissue is made up of cells, protein fibers, and ground substance. And I'll explain all that here in a moment, what the protein fibers are and what the ground substance. These last 2, protein fibers and ground substance, we call both of those extracellular matrix. Extracellular matrix. So another way of me describing connective tissue is I could say to you, all right, connective tissue is made up of cells and then everything outside of the cells, which is what we call the extracellular matrix. And then you would say, well, Dr. Kaz, what is the extracellular matrix? And then I would respond to you, the extracellular matrix is made up of protein fibers and ground substance, which the cells make. The cells make the protein fibers, the cells make the ground substance. So you could say the extracellular matrix is made by the cells. All right, I hope you understand that. I think I explained it better to you than my last class. All right, so we're going to see in all these different types of connective tissue, all right, specific cell types that are going to be present for that connective tissue. You might find some cell types in a couple different types of connective tissue, okay? But those specific cell types you're going to have specific cell types for classes of connective tissue. Now, when we were talking about epithelial tissue, this guy right here, right? You noticed that in most of those tissue slides I was showing you, all right, if not all of them, excuse me, connective tissue, those cells were in close quarters with one another. All right, they were kind of, they were tightly packed. Well, in connective tissue, most of the cells won't touch each other at all. Okay, most, not all, but most. Epithelial tissue, that's one, and I'll get into this in more detail when we do chapter 5 in lecture. But epithelial tissue, one of the characteristics of epithelial tissue is that the cells are tightly packed with one another. Connective tissue, okay, most of the cells won't even touch each other. So let's talk about the cells. There's two types of cells, or two classes of cells in connective tissue. We have resident cells and we have wandering cells. And the names pretty much will spell it out for you as to what they do. Okay, resident cells stay in the tissue, they don't leave. Wandering cells, just like the name implies, they're going to move around. They're nomadic. So let's talk about the first type, the resident cells. Okay, their job is going to be to support, maintain, and repair the extracellular matrix that they produced. Seems pretty easy, right? Okay, like what do they call it? A superintendent of a building. Okay, they didn't necessarily make the building, but a superintendent's job, or the super, is to fix and repair stuff, maintain, help to support the building. Okay, so that's what these resident cells do. They don't leave. So let's talk about a few of these. Fibroblasts, right? These cells are the most abundant type of resident cell in connective tissue proper. Dr. Kaz, I have no idea what connective tissue proper is. Don't worry, I'll tell you that in a moment. Okay, because when we start to classify and talk about the different types of connective tissue, all right, this is going to be one of the classes of connective tissue. I'll hit that in a second. But I want you to think of these fibroblasts like a football, fat in the middle and tapered on the ends. Okay. And their job is to make the protein fibers and the ground substance. That's what they do. So another type of resident cell that we see in our connective tissue are adipocytes, fat cells. You heard me talk about that in lecture today. Okay. These cells are specific for adipose tissue. And so they're going to appear in these clusters. All right. So they're going to house those lipids. So these cells will fill up. They're like a storage facility, like a grain silo. But in this situation, they're going to store lipids instead of grain. All right. So we're going to see adipocytes. They're going to be the resident cell in adipose tissue. Mesenchymal cells. You'll see this in a couple other chapters, but I want you to memorize this. They're embryonic stem cells. What does that mean? That means that these cells can turn into whatever type of cell they want. It's pretty nice because not all stem cells can differentiate or turn into any type of cell. Some stem cells can only become a specific type of cell. Okay, but embryonic stem cells, oh no, they can do whatever they want, almost. Okay, so these cells, all right, are going to be called into action if another cell in that tissue has become damaged. And what they'll do is they'll divide. So once where you add one cell, you'll have two. All right, so the first cell, or one of those cells, I should say, is going to turn into another mesenchymal cell. The other cell is going to turn into, say, a committed cell. So what's a committed cell? Well, fibroblasts are a committed cell. Adipocytes are a committed cell. So if one of those cells, for example, if a fibroblast gets damaged and there's mesenchymal cells nearby, okay. If it gets damaged, the mesenchymal cell will divide, and one of the cells that it makes will turn into the fibroblast cell. One of my favorite types of resident cells are the fixed macrophages. Well, I love macrophages in general, and after you study the immune system, you'll know why, because they do a lot of stuff. I mean, they just kick butt. Anyways, these cells, all right, are a type of white blood cell. Okay, we call those leukocytes. Leukocytes are white blood cells. So their job, all right, mainly is going to help be involved in the immune response. but they'll also do some other things. If you have some tissue that gets damaged, like say you get a cut in your finger, okay, well, what will happen is that fixed macrophage, if that cut is nearby, that fixed macrophage will start to nibble on and eat up the damaged cells. All right, and in the process, if you got cut and some bacteria got in there or a virus or something, then it would eat that. So I think of a macrophage like Pac-Man. Pac-Man. Here's a bacteria. And so it's going to go in and eat it up, gobbles it up. And so when it does that, okay, when it engulfs whatever that damaged cell or that pathogen is, we call that phagocytation. All right, it goes around and it phagocytizes these items, these damaged cells or these viruses or bacteria. And you'll see these all over the tissue. And so say it is a bacteria, okay? Well, what will happen is the macrophages are going to release these chemicals. Guess what those chemicals are called? All right, eicosanoids. Remember those? Those locally acting hormones that we discussed, leukotrienes, prostaglandins, prostacyclines, thromboxanes, okay? It's going to release these chemicals that will attract the other type of cell in connective tissue, wandering cells. It's going to put a signal out, calling all cars, calling all macrophages or white blood cells or other types of cells, all right, for whatever the situation is. Come here, come to me, followed by chemical trail. I need your help. And that's what happens. All right, so the wandering cells are the other classification of the cells for the connective tissue. And as the name implies, these cells can move around. They're on the move, right? The majority of these cells are a part of the immune system. And part of the immune system's responsibility is to help repair any damage done to the extracellular matrix, right? So we call these the leukocytes, the white blood cells. And not only are they going to help repair the damage to the extracellular matrix, if during whatever it was that damaged that extracellular matrix and if any harmful materials got inside the body, well, these cells will help to protect the body and hopefully destroy any dangerous or pathogenic material that has entered the body. So some of the types of wandering cells we're going to discuss. First one here is the mast cells. Folks, those of you that are unfortunately people that suffer from allergies, you can thank these cells. These cells play a role in that. They're not the only cell, but they play a role. So you're going to see these cells in close proximity to blood vessels. Because what will happen is, say you get some damage, all right, near to where these cells are, it's close to a blood vessel, and it cuts into the blood vessel, okay? Well, the blood carries vital, important material to fix these types of injuries. So the mast cells make it possible for the healing process to occur and that it doesn't get shut down prematurely because it releases first heparin. And that's going to inhibit blood clotting because we don't want to clot the blood quite yet because we need some of that blood to infiltrate and flow out of the blood vessel into the tissue there because the blood carries some of those white blood cells and some of those proteins that we need to help to repair that damaged tissue. So heparin gets released by the mast cells. Okay, so it prohibits the blood clotting. All right, it also releases histamine. Folks, you've heard of this before. You've probably taken medication like Benadryl. It's called antihistamine. Okay, and what histamine does is it causes dilation of blood vessels. What does that mean? It means it makes the blood vessels bigger. But by doing so, it makes the blood vessels leaky. And again, initially, if there's an injury going on, that's good. We want the blood vessels to be leaky because, again, the stuff that we need to help repair the problem is in the blood. So we need to get it out of the blood and into the tissue. So we make the blood vessels leaky, and that's what these mast cells do. So they inhibit the blood clotting and they make our blood vessels leaky so we can help repair the area there. So another type of wandering cell is the plasma cells. So you heard me talk about leukocytes, which are the white blood cells. All right. Well, one of the classification for the leukocytes are what we call lymphocytes, and there's two types. You've got your T lymphocytes and your B lymphocytes. You've heard a lot about B lymphocytes, all right, specifically because you've heard about antibodies recently. Antibodies are proteins. Antibodies have been talked about quite a bit with COVID. So the cell that makes the antibodies are the plasma cells. Where do plasma cells come from? B lymphocytes. Folks, please don't make this mistake. B lymphocytes do not make antibodies. Plasma cells do. Please don't make that mistake and get that confused. Okay? B lymphocytes will turn into plasma cells, all right, when they become activated by some sort of pathogen, and then the plasma cells will make the antibodies. And then the antibodies go to work on destroying, all right, that pathogen. And if that pathogen has infected a healthy cell, well, guess what? They're going to go after that once healthy cell that's now infected and kill that cell. All right, plasma cells are cool. Well, we talked about the fixed macrophages. Well, guess what? We got its cousin, the free macrophages. These guys are mobile. They do the same thing. They do the same thing. All right, they're going to phagocytize things. They eat stuff up. They can initiate the immune response. They can get rid of damaged tissue, all right, and help with the repair. They're the same thing as the fixed, except they're mobile. All right, and then we have our neutrophils and our T lymphocytes. I already talked about the lymphocytes before with the B lymphocytes. Well, the other type of lymphocyte is the T lymphocyte. And the T lymphocytes like to go after viruses, but that's not the only thing that they go after. So they're going to attack different types of foreign materials. Okay, and that includes viruses or infected cells. The other type of leukocyte is the neutrophils. Neutrophils, similar macrophages, they're going to phagocytize things, but they love bacteria. So rule of thumb, pretty much the predominant cell, okay, that is going to attack bacteria is going to be the neutrophils, and the predominant cell that usually goes after viruses are going to be lymphocytes. Not always the case, but usually if you're looking at somebody's blood work and you notice that they have elevated white blood cells, and then it's called the CBC with differential, right? And it breaks down all the components of the blood. And so you'll look at the CBC with diff and you'll see, all right, I see an elevated white blood cell count here. What white blood cells are elevated? And if you see primarily neutrophils, then you're going to think not just solely, but you're thinking, all right, this person may have a bacterial infection. All right, that's not straight across the board, but in most cases, that's where people start to think. Okay, so the first part of connective tissue, again, let me three components of connective tissue are the cells. We just talked about that. Now we're going to talk about the protein fibers. And then lastly, we'll talk about ground substance. Okay, and the last two and three, together, we call that the extracellular matrix. Okay, so when we're talking about protein fibers, there's three types: collagen, reticular fibers, and elastic fibers. Collagen fibers are the largest, and they do not branch. They are unbranched protein fibers, and they're strong like cables. So you're going to see them in very strong tissue like tendons and ligaments. All right, the next type of protein fiber are reticular fibers. All right, they're going to be a little bit thinner than collagen. They do branch. And you're going to see these type of fibers in organs, the tissues of organs that are going to basically create small compartments in the organs. And we see that in a lot of the lymphatic organs, like bone marrow, lymph nodes, right? The spleen. All right, all of these organs and tissues have these small little compartments inside. And in those compartments, that's where you'll see a lot of your white blood cells. They're going to hang out. All right, so these reticular fibers, think of them as creating, all right, these compartments within the organs inside. And so we call that stroma. And then finally, the last type of fiber, and if you look at the name, you can pretty much tell what it does, is elastic fibers. All right, it has that elastin protein in it. So it allows these fibers to stretch and recoil like your waistband in your underwear, your gym shorts or whatever. And so you're going to see these fibers in high abundance in tissues and in organs that have to have some stretch and recoil. All right, your skin, for example. All right, if you pull on the back of your, if you pull on the skin on the back of your hand and you let go of it, it should immediately go back to being flat on the back of your hand. That's because of those elastic fibers there. Your arteries, the blood vessels, okay, when you're exercising, you're increasing your blood pressure, you're increasing your blood volume, because as you're working out, you're running, your muscles need more blood because it needs more nutrients and oxygen. So we need, those blood vessels will get bigger, though we call it vasodilation. And so they'll increase in size. And what allows it to increase in size are those elastic fibers. And then when you stop working out and your blood pressure decreases back to normal, they'll rebound and shrink back to their original size. Okay, the last type of our component to our connective tissue is the ground substance. I'll make it real simple on you. Ground substance is pretty much going to be water and large molecules. All right, really, that's what it is. Water and large molecules. Hence, it is made up of non-cellular material, okay, that the cells of the connective tissue will make. So I look at it like this. Ground substance, like if you're a painter, the ground substance is the canvas, okay? And then the paint is going to be the cells and the protein fibers on that canvas. So ground substance comes at varying levels of consistency, to like a goo-like material to solid. Right, so your blood is going to be viscous. Again, it won't be the same as water. It's a little bit thicker than water, like motor oil. All right, maybe a little bit less thick than motor oil. All right, so we describe that as being viscous. All right, bone is absolutely solid, very, very little flexibility there. But if you want to kind of go with something that's a little bit less solid and a little bit more flexible, a semi-solid, and that's our cartilage. So we're going to talk about these different types. So for ground substance, you're going to have these different types of molecules found within it. So you have glycose, aminoglycans or GAGs, proteoglycans, and glycoproteins. And we've talked about glycoproteins back in chapter 2 when we were talking about those types of proteins that have carbohydrates attached to them. So basically, a glycosaminoglycan is a large molecule. And because of its molecular makeup, it is going to attract positively charged ions. And because of that, water is going to follow, because I haven't said this before, and I'm going to tell you this right now, and you're going to carry this over into Bio 211. Water is a follower. Water follows salt and sodium. Water follows glucose. Okay, why do you think people with diabetes, all right, pee all the time. It's because they're dumping large quantities of glucose into the urine. And because the glucose goes into the urine, the water follows the glucose. And so therefore water goes into the urine. So water is just, it's a big follower. So these glycosaminoglycans are going to attract these positively charged ions, these cation ions, all right, and water is going to follow it. The proteoglycans are going to attach themselves onto the glycosaminoglycans. And then finally, our glycoproteins, again, you'll see these guys here because we need to actually hold, all right, the cells and the protein fibers to the ground substance. Okay, we got to anchor it down there. So the glycoproteins help with that. All right, here's a quick picture of our connective tissue. And a quick story about scurvy. Scurvy is going to be a condition that you don't see too often nowadays. You used to see it quite a bit when folks were traveling back and forth across the ocean for several months at a time. They were malnourished. Specifically, these folks were malnourished, all right, from certain foods high in vitamin C. Well, vitamin C is important for several reasons. It helps with immune strength, but also it helps with the proper formation of collagen. Okay, collagen is found in a lot of tissues, folks. Scar tissue, ligaments, tendons, okay, blood vessel walls. It's all over the place. And what it does is it helps to strengthen these tissues. Okay, and over time, as you get older, as you age, you don't make as much collagen, so these tissues become more fragile. For example, skin. Your skin is pretty healthy and strong right now, okay? But when you're 80, 90, even 100, your skin thins out and becomes less strong because there's less collagen. Well, anyways, so collagen during its formation needs vitamin C, all right, in order to make proper collagen or healthy collagen. Because at one point, collagen during its formation has split ends. Now, some of you know what I'm talking about, all right? I'm assuming more women do than men. The end of your hair, you hear people say it all the time. I went to the stylist and they said I had a lot of split ends, so they just cut my split ends off. Basically, that's when the end of your hair just kind of tethers out. And that's what happens with collagen. The ends of the collagen just kind of tether out. So normally vitamin C comes in and it cleaves off those tethered portions. So we're just left with this guy. And that's good. That's what we want. That makes a nice, strong, healthy collagen. But because we're lacking vitamin C, right, we don't tether off those split ends. And so when we go ahead to make our final collagen product, it sucks. It's not as strong. So some of the symptoms that we see are going to be muscle weakness, just overall fatigue and weakness, gum ulceration. What does that mean? Bleeding gums. You'll get petechial hemorrhages. All right. For example, if you look at your shins, you have all these little red dots right on your shin. And collagen is largely important in the proper formation for bone. So if this condition goes unaddressed and it goes on for a long enough time, you will have abnormal bone growth going on. So it is caused by nutritional deficiencies, okay? And so we found out that if you give folks foods that are high in vitamin C, like citrus fruits, it helps to prevent that. If you see a case of scurvy in modern day America, it's because of malnutrition. Not necessarily, no. And that's a great question. Do collagen supplements actually help? No, because if you're still having vitamin C deficiency, your body's still going to make collagen on its own, even though if you're supplementing it. All right, now, granted, the collagen that you'll be taking in, all right, will be an ingredient utilized but that is something you can't treat scurvy by taking collagen supplements. But collagen supplements just provide your body with another source of collagen, but your body will still keep making the ineffectual collagen. But that's a great question. Always thinking. I like it. Okay, so now you're going to see and maybe be somewhat intimidated by this slide here, figure 5.9. All right, this is how we're going to classify our connective tissue. And so when I talk about connective tissue, there's 3 types. The first type is, I'm just going to abbreviate, connective tissue proper. The second type is supporting connective tissue. And then the third type is going to be fluid connective tissue. We're not going to talk too much about fluid connective tissue because this is going to be more in 211. Okay, but I want you to be familiar. We're going to spend most of our time on connective tissue proper and supporting connective tissue. Now, if you notice, under connective tissue proper, we have 2 further subdivisions. All right, we have loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. And then under each of those, we have 3 specific types. So loose has areolar, adipose, and reticular. And then dense has dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. So we're going to go through all this, but I want you to know that there's 3 types of connective tissue: connective tissue proper, supporting connective tissue, and fluid connective tissue. All right, so let's talk about our first one here, which is loose connective tissue. So a couple of the qualities that loose connective tissue has. One, it has few cells and it has few protein fibers. And if you're basically looking at it, it looks very chaotic. There's cells scattered all over the tissue. The protein fibers are running in all different directions: north, south, east, west, north, south, northeast by northwest. I mean, all just random directions all over the place. So there's a certain pattern of irregularity going on. But loose connective tissue has a huge amount of ground substance. And so there's a lot of space in loose connective tissue. So guess what? If there's a lot of space in this connective tissue, we're going to fill it with something. Your body wants to fill it with blood vessels, BVs. So loose connective tissue, all right, is going to be highly vascularized, lots of blood vessels. So this type of connective tissue is going to be considered the body's packing material. You're just going to see it all over the place. It's like a seat filler on the Oscars. Okay, we're just going to fill, all right, these areas up with this type of tissue. So there's 3 types: areolar, adipose, and reticular. So the first type, the areolar, again, not much organization going on, all right, but we will see collagen protein fibers and elastic protein fibers. And like I said, it's going to have a large number of blood vessels. It'll be highly vascularized. So in this type of connective tissue, we're going to see a variety of different types of cells. A lot of fibroblasts, you'll see mast cells, you'll see macrophages, both fixed and wandering. You're going to see a whole bunch of different cells throughout this type of connective tissue. And mainly the ground substance, like I said, there's going to be a lot of it, but it's going to be viscous. It's going to be more of like a fluid type of ground substance here. So we're going to see this type of tissue in the deeper layer of your skin. And then there's an area of tissue underneath your skin called the subcutaneous layer. We're going to find some fat there, but we'll also find the areolar connective tissue there. This stuff, like I said, it's the body's packing material. So we're going to see it around organs inside the body. We're going to see it around your muscles and your nerves, and we're going to see it around the blood vessels. That's the packing material. It's going to be all over that stuff. All right, because again, it's going to offer, all right, a certain amount of protection to those tissues and to those organs. So the next type of connective tissue for connective tissue proper, all right, for loose connective tissue is going to be the adipose tissue. We know it as fat. And the predominant cell type are going to be the adipocytes. Those are the cells that store the lipids. Now in lecture, we talked about, all right, the functions of fat. And we talked about storage of energy, insulation, and cushioning. Well, that is specific for white fat. And that's pretty much the fat that most of us have right now. But when we were younger, we had the brown fat. All right, when I say younger, I'm talking about babies. Okay. And so this fat, as we age, it becomes less and less and less. And in adults, you'll find small bits of it, like behind the shoulder blades. All right, but its job is to generate heat. That's all it does. Of course, as we get older, we don't need it as much. So, of course, it goes away. Now, with adipose tissue, all right, you will see, all right, the size of these cells, all right, will increase or decrease depending on what your body is doing. So if you're in a constantly fed state and your energy requirements are low, you can have an increase in adipose tissue because, like I said, you know the body wants to save lipids for a rainy day. So you'll have an increase in adipose tissue, whereas you'll get a decrease in adipose tissue, all right, if you have high energy, all right, demands, okay, and that your excess energy or the amount of food that you're taking in or nutrition is lower. All right, so if you're not eating a lot of junk food and that sort of thing, you have high energy levels, all right, or requirements, your job, you have to do a lot of walking, let's say, for your job, all right, your adipose tissue will decrease because the adipocytes will be shrinking since there's less lipids to put into into the cells there. The last type of loose connective tissue is reticular connective tissue. Did you know that I like Doctor Who? Oh, yes. Actually, my game handle on Xbox is Dr. Whovian. Yes, I'm a big fan. Big fan. Wait, what did you say? I missed it. Yes, he's one of my favorites. I can't remember which doctor number he was. Maybe 10. I'm watching this other show called The Leftovers on HBO, and it's got the 9th Doctor on there, Christopher Eccleston. He only did it for one season. He was the first Doctor of the new episodes, I guess you would call it. I'm geeking out here. I gotta get back to work, Tanya. I can't talk about this right now. Although I love Doctor Who. All right. No, it's all right. It's all right. All right, so the last type, loose connective tissue, the last type of loose connective tissue is reticular connective tissue. All right, and so remember what I said, when we're talking about the different types of protein fibers, all right, we're gonna see, all right, the majority of the protein fibers in this type of connective tissue is gonna be reticular fibers, and reticular fibers make compartments, all right? And so we'll see quite a bit of fibroblasts there, which will help to generate the reticular fibers, but also white blood cells. So the reticular connective tissue is going to help make up the framework for a lot of these organs that I was telling you about, the lymphatic organs. all right, the lymph nodes, the bone marrow, and the spleen there. And these are all lymphatic organs that help with immune function. And so if you look down here at our picture, you can see that there's lots of little compartments in there. And in all, you can't, a lot of it's blurry, all right, but you'll see that there's some cells over here, groups of cells over here. Those are all white blood cells, and they're just hanging out, waiting to go to work. Okay, so that was for the first type of connective tissue proper. The second type of connective tissue proper is dense connective tissue. And there's three categories to that we'll go over in a moment. But big difference between dense connective tissue and loose connective tissue. Dense connective tissue has little to no ground substance. All right. Protein fibers are going to be the predominant component of the connective tissue that you'll see, and the predominant protein fiber that you'll see in this tissue are going to be collagen fibers. So there's three types: dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. So when you see dense regular connective tissue, I want you to think of lasagna noodles. And if you've ever made lasagna, when you're making the layers, you layer the noodles on there. That's what you're doing with this connective tissue. All of the collagen fibers are arranged in a parallel fashion to each other, and they're tightly packed. If you look down here at our slide, you can see the ground substance is anywhere on that slide that you can see white. And so if you notice, there's hardly any white on that ground substance. Okay, so there's very little ground substance. So these collagen fibers are so tightly packed and laid down in a parallel arrangement to one another, they're very strong, especially to forces that are applied on that tissue in a single direction. So you're going to see this connective tissue in our ligaments. That's the tissue that connects bone to bone, and tendons. That's the tissue that connects muscles to bone. And since we don't have a lot of ground substance, we don't have a lot of space, so we'll have very few blood vessels. And since we have very few blood vessels, a good blood supply helps with healing. So we have very few blood vessels, we have poor blood supply, therefore it takes a long time for these tissues to heal. No worries. All right, so that is dense regular connective tissue. So this type of connective tissue is really resilient to stresses applied in one direction. I mean, our tendons, for example, often have stresses applied in one direction. The biggest and strongest tendon in the body is the Achilles tendon, also known as the calcaneal tendon. It has the tensile strength of steel, which basically means you can hang a Volkswagen Bug off of your Achilles tendon, and a healthy Achilles tendon. If you have somebody that has torn their Achilles tendon, there's something wrong with that Achilles tendon. All right, the second type of dense connective tissue is dense irregular connective tissue. Now we say irregular because the arrangement of the collagen fibers is chaotic and haphazard. So the collagen fibers go in all these different directions and they're arranged in clumps. All right, the nice thing is that this type of tissue can handle stress in multiple directions. But even though it can handle stress in multiple directions, it still won't be as strong as the dense regular connective tissue and its ability to handle stress in the one direction. But this type of connective tissue does offer great support and resistance to stresses in multiple directions. So we're going to see this in the deep layer of the skin, the dermis. We're also going to see it covering our bones. It's going to cover our cartilage, and we'll also see it cover a lot of the internal organs in our body. It forms the capsule, like your kidneys, for example, have a capsule that surrounds it. and it's made up of the dense irregular connective tissue. And these capsules protect the organ somewhat, but it also allows other things to attach to the capsule and not to the organ. So it's good. And the last type of dense, connective tissue is elastic connective tissue. It's predominantly made up of elastic fibers. And we know that elastic fibers can stretch and recoil. But this arrangement of the elastic fibers, we pack them close together. All right, so you're going to see this type of connective tissue in areas that, again, stretch and recoil. So walls of those large arteries, right, inside our trachea and our vocal cords, which I'm using right now. All right, that's the first category of connective tissue. Connective tissue proper is out of the way. We did both loose and dense connective tissue. So now let's go on to the second type of connective tissue, which is called supporting connective tissue. And there's two types. There's two types of supporting connective tissue. There's cartilage and bone. Okay, so we just got done with connective tissue proper. Done, check mark. Now we're on to supporting connective tissue. We have cartilage and bone. So let's start off with cartilage. We have three types of cartilage: hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. All right, hyaline cartilage, the most common type. It'll often appear blue. All right, well, when we look at it grossly, it'll appear blue, but when we look at it under a microscope, nice and clear. All right, our hyaline cartilage comes with perichondrium. What is perichondrium? Remember when I said, all right, when we were talking about here with dense irregular connective tissue, perichondrium is the covering to cartilage, and it's made up of dense irregular connective tissue. So our hyaline cartilage has a dense irregular connective tissue coating, right, which helps to protect it, also helps to give it shape. So we're going to find hyaline cartilage. This is the most common type and abundant type of cartilage in the body. You're going to find it in your nose, your trachea. When we were discussing the trachea, you saw those blue rings around the trachea. Those are hyaline cartilage C rings. You're also going to find it in your larynx. Right? Then you can also see it in your costal cartilage, which is the cartilage that attaches your ribs to your sternum, which is that chest bone right in the middle of your thorax, on the ends of your long bones, and most of your fetal skeleton. So when you start to take on a human form, when you're developing inside of mommy, all right, you don't grow bone right away. Okay, your skeleton is made up of cartilage, and then over time that cartilage will turn into bone, and we'll discuss that in chapter 7. Going back to the articular ends of the long bones there, hyaline cartilage is on the ends of those long bones to offer protection, but also to reduce friction. So have you ever heard somebody say, I don't have any more cartilage in my knees? Most often they're referring to this hyaline cartilage that's worn away. The second type of cartilage is fibrocartilage. This stuff is awesome because this is the cartilage where we're going to find in areas of your skeleton that are weight bearing. So we're going to find it in your spine. We're going to find it in your knees. Okay. So its job is to resist compressive forces. So the protein fibers predominantly are going to be collagen because it's the strongest, but the protein fibers are so densely packed. There's very little ground substance. All right. Also, there is no perichondrium. This is the only type of cartilage that does not have perichondrium. Great test question. So we're only going to find this type of cartilage in 3 places. In the intervertebral discs, okay, those are the discs in between the vertebrae, which are the bones in your spine. All right. In your knee joints, we call those the menisci. Those are the shock absorbers of the knee. And then in the pubic symphysis. The pubic symphysis is where your 2 hip bones meet each other in the front, just below your belly button. So you have a little disc there in between those two hip bones there. And that's called the pubic symphysis. There's only 3 places that you're going to find fibrocartilage. You need to know those 3 places. All right, the last type of cartilage, elastic cartilage. And like the term says, elastic, so we think stretch and recoil, right? So this type of cartilage is going to be flexible and springy. That's awesome. But we'll again see that the elastic fibers are going to be packed tightly. So that means not only are they going to be flexible, but they're going to be quite tough and resilient. And they need to be, okay? Because where we find them is going to be important, or find this type of cartilage is going to be important. I'll talk about that in a second. So the cells of this tissue, which are called chondrocytes, the chondrocytes make the cartilage, they're packed close together. And this tissue does have a perichondrium. So it has that dense irregular coating on the outside. So we'll see the elastic cartilage in your external ear. What's that? That's called the pinna, right here. So if you take your ear and you bend it forward and you let go, it springs back into shape. We also find it in the epiglottis. This guy is hugely important. It keeps us from choking. The epiglottis is this structure that sits over the opening to your trachea. We call it the epiglottis. And so as you're swallowing liquid or swallowing food, as it's moving down the back of your throat, all right, those substances push the epiglottis down, and the epiglottis will cover your trachea for a brief moment. And it prevents food or liquid from going to your lungs, and make sure that that food and liquid goes to your esophagus and stomach. And then when you're done swallowing, it springs back open, okay, because it's flexible and incredibly resilient. All right, the other type of connective tissue, the other type of supporting connective tissue is bone. And there's 2 types of bone. There's compact bone and there's spongy bone. When we go over the slides for slide identification, I'll show you the spongy bone. All right, but here I've got a picture of the compact bone. All right, so we'll go into more detail as to the functions of this type of connective tissue. All right, but obviously you know that bone is made for movements. All right, it's going to help to support some of the soft tissue structures. It protects the organs, like how your ribs will protect your heart and lungs. All right, how your skull protects your brain. All right, it's also a storage site, all right, for some of the elements, calcium, phosphate, all right. And then also we'll see in the spongy bone, that's where your blood cells are made. That's called hemopoiesis, where we make our red blood cells, our white blood cells, our platelets. So we'll get into more detail. But again, compact bone, all right, is a solid ground substance. Okay, so very little bit of movement and flexibility. So there's not a lot of space, all right, that we'll see. And we'll get into more of the details of this type of tissue later on, all right, when we get into chapter 7. Okay, which brings me to the last type of connective tissue, fluid connective tissue. Okay, so supporting connective tissue, done. Now, fluid connective tissue, we're not going to talk about it very much because you're going to cover it in much more detail in 211, but there's 2 types of fluid connective tissue, blood and lymph. All right, so blood, okay, is going to be made up of the cells, the foreign blood elements, which are going to be red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, okay, all that. And then the ground substance will be the blood plasma, the fluid portion of your blood. All right, so, and we'll also see in the blood plasma all these other substances that have dissolved into the blood plasma. Certain water-soluble elements, certain hormones will be found in the blood plasma. Ions like calcium, magnesium, phosphate, sodium, all that fun stuff. All right, you'll see oxygen, carbon dioxide. All right, so blood is going to play a large role, but like I said, you're going to get into that detail much more in future chapters. All righty. So that actually concludes what I want to cover for today's tissue lab topic. Any questions about anything?